Welcome to The Moment That Changed Everything, the show where we interview notable creative people to gain insights into how they got started and learn more about the moments that shaped them and their careers. On today's episode, I sit down with Joe Musicco.
The hardest job to get into advertising is the first one. And then at the end of the day, you're just like, just give me a chance. Breaking in is really tough. So don't get demoralized. But then part B of that is once you're in, look at that as the opportunity that it clearly is and work really, really hard.
Joe is currently a professor at Sheridan College, where he teaches at the Pilon School of Business. Before making his move into teaching, Joe held very senior positions at various agencies, winning many top advertising awards. And today, we hear his unique perspective on why the ad industry needs more education. Enjoy. So Joe, welcome to the show.
I am pleased to be here.
It's great that you're here. I think the last time that we talked, I was, coming to see you maybe for a bit of career advice because I was in between things. At that time, you were creative director at Kobo.
That's right.
I thought you'd be a great subject for this podcast and a great guest because your career isn't necessarily a linear one, although it's kept to advertising and communication. You started as a writer. You've made several moves, management at agencies, then moving to kind of an internal agency with Chael Communications.
Yeah, I've had a path for sure.
Yeah, and then now I guess a professor at Sheridan College.
That's right. So now teaching everything that I've learned. It's interesting that you bring up having come to see me later on in your career, and that's one of the fascinating things about advertising, I think, is that sometimes somebody who you work with could end up being your boss, or they could end up being a mentor and a trusted advisor or a friend. And then you continue to have conversations well into the future. And it's one of the great things I think about this business.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I came to see you is because I always felt like that you were someone who wasn't actually on a linear path, and I thought that kind of eclectic way of your approach to managing your career was one that was really helpful to get your insight and stuff like that. So I was always kind of, it's great that you're here so that we can kind of get into some of this about your career. But where I like to start is, are you a Toronto guy? Did you grow up here?
I actually grew up a little bit north of Toronto, in Barrie. So a small townish boy, actually. I spent time here, especially as I got a little bit older. But no, I wasn't in Toronto proper. I was outside of it, and the joke is in Barrie, you either played hockey or you skied. And I skied, but I always kind of felt like I knew that I would end up in the city. Just my interests took me, I think, beyond the place where I grew up. But like all of us, I still carry a lot of my childhood and my upbringing with me, and I think that is an invaluable part, frankly, of the creative person that I became.
What did your parents do?
My dad owned a hairstyling salon, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom. So she had some, and eventually she did some part-time jobs eventually, but, modest upbringing. I didn't necessarily have somebody modeling the business for me. I kind of had to find it on my own.
Yeah, you didn't have any pressure from your dad to maybe get into the hairstyling business?
No, right?
I don't want to.
We have cameras here, so that joke makes more sense with the lens, but yeah. No, you know what? My parents were good that way. They didn't apply a lot of pressure to me to become something, or to become something that they wanted. And on the other side of that pendulum, sometimes I felt like I didn't necessarily have a ton of direction from them. So that allowed me a lot of freedom to decide what it is that I wanted to do. And that's something that now that I'm an adult, that I appreciated. I wasn't expected to live up to their expectations of what they thought was the right thing to do. I was more allowed to explore and find the things that interested me, and it turned out that writing and advertising was one of those things.
I mean, can you remember, for me, I know I want to say maybe in grade 7, we had a creative writing course, And that was the first time I got sort of a little bit of validation in terms of a bit of creative writing, where the teacher decided to read what I had written to the class. And I thought, oh, wow, someone's telling me, I guess, that I'm okay at something. And that was kind of the first little whisper of like maybe what I could do for a living as I grew up. Because I wasn't one of those people who are like, I want to be a cop from day one and just like laser focus and you become one. So, what was your first inkling that you wanted to be a writer?
I think I had perhaps a couple of those moments, but the one that stands out in my mind, it was grade 10, and it was Miss Snyder's English class. And I wrote an essay on the book Obasan, which was about the Japanese concentration camps in Canada. Sad book, a very powerful book, a bit of a dry book, but I got the best feedback from her. And to your point, it gives you so much confidence to actually have somebody whose opinion you respect enthusiastically tell you, you know what, you're good at this. And that was one of those things. And I had it's probably one of the reasons I actually ended up becoming a professor and a teacher after my journey in the business as well. It's because I think those people are so important. And there's, unfortunately, I think there's not a lot of them in the business. You're kind of in advertising. I call it it's trial by inferno. You're thrown right into the fire, and a lot of people are frankly either too busy or not interested enough to actually walk you along and take interest in your own development. And I had some of those people, and coincidentally, you were one of the people who gave me an opportunity, or at least took part in that. You saw my book and you brought it up to our CD at the time. And if I hadn't met you, if you hadn't seen something in that portfolio, we wouldn't be sitting here today, and I wouldn't have had a 2-decade really great career in a business that I have loved.
Yeah, you bring that up, and I do recall that time, and it was so easy for me, and I did nothing really. Yeah. I looked at your portfolio and I thought, oh, this guy, it was better than most portfolios I'd seen at that level, and so it was so easy for me to go to Duncan Bruce, who was the then creative director, and kind of say, I think you should look at this guy's stuff because he seems like a great candidate. But I do think I agree with you that they're few and far between. You get a lot of light dustings of someone assessing your work before you actually run into someone who can give you the real tangible things that you trust, who you respect, that then you can kind of pay it forward. And I definitely had that in my experience too. Someone who is like not, would sit down for like an hour and talk to you about your portfolio and give you the real kind of feedback that you need to actually get better.
For sure.
So that's really interesting. So you, I'm assuming you went to high school in Barrie?
I did. You know what, and that was, I'm going to call it a pretty typical existence in high school. I did relatively well. I kind of had to navigate things on my own a little bit. Back to my dad for a moment. He was a very bright guy who came to Toronto from Italy just post-war, and he was expected to help the family by working really early. So he left, I think he left high school during or after grade 10. So I took interest to subjects naturally. And I did pretty well in school. On the negative side, I think I did well in school without putting in as much effort as I could have. So I didn't necessarily develop a proper work ethic until later on. And but from high school, I did a degree at Western. I initially had intended on going into business. I was in a pre-business program, and I was doing a little bit better in some of the subjects that were a little bit less expected. So French and political science, interestingly. But it's not a complete disconnect, because both of those dealt with the realm of ideas and forced me to write, forced me to think, forced me to be creative. And the journey from there to writing, it was a short one. I actually really liked writing, And while I was at university, it wasn't until my last year, unfortunately, but they had a great paper called the Gazette. I started writing articles for that as well. I've always been able to express myself with pen and paper, or the laptop more recently. And I enjoy it. I enjoyed thinking about stuff, thinking deeply about stuff, and expressing myself in a way that's novel and interesting and unusual that has an impact on the people that are reading it.
Yeah, and when I think about, I've read some of your longer articles and opinions on things. I get a sense from when I read it that you're someone who really does enjoy the craft of writing.
Yeah.
I know we're going kind of back and forth with your journey, and I thought we'd start with school and move on to career, but
why shouldn't the conversation meander? I mean, that's kind of the path that I've taken.
That's right. I mean, but I'll jump forward to one of the questions I wanted to talk to you about was how teaching has changed a little bit, and maybe one specific thing might be new media and what that means for professors. When I went to school, I know that we kind of had our traditional means by which we displayed creativity, and now that has been expanded and fragmented such that big ideas have so many other ways to be showcased. So maybe talk to that a little bit.
You bet. So there's a few things that I think about this. I struggle a little bit with this idea of digital natives, which is, people who have never grown up in a time where they've never had a computer or a smartphone. It's not that I struggle with that fact. It's more that, I feel fortunate because I existed pre-device and post-device. My first job in advertising, I'm going to date myself horribly here, but 1997, and Chiat Day at the time, where you and I were for a little while, they were actually quite progressive. They sort of pioneered this idea of the virtual office, and they were among the first agencies that had the old Mac laptops, which were nice and thick. It looked more like a phone book than the AirBook now. But my entire time in the business has always been digital in nature. So if I didn't actually find like it was a difficult transition to make. Now, no question, as a creative director, it's a huge learning curve, and you have to immerse yourself in all sorts of different non-traditional types of communication that maybe you weren't familiar with. You have to learn them yourself, and that's always a little bit difficult initially, but eventually it comes around. And everybody now has a smartphone in their pocket. That's how we communicate with each other. That's how we digest and absorb all of our media. So it just becomes natural. So if you're curious about life, if you like things and are interested in things, I feel like it's easier. It hasn't really been too intimidating for me, fortunately. It's, again, not without its learning curve, but I've appreciated, like everybody else, I binge Netflix instead of watch appointment television, and most of the stuff that I read is online, and it just happens. It just happens naturally.
I mean, I remember that time too. 97, we had those Macs that were kind of all in one kind of monolith with the hard disk that you would put in there. And one of the things that I remember about that time was, of course, with new media comes new etiquette. And we were just learning about that. Like, I can remember walking down the agency hall, and it was open concept at Chiat Day, and walking down the hall and someone saying, hey, take a look at this. And it would be like, something you couldn't unsee.
Yeah.
Because someone was on the internet, looking at something, and we hadn't learned yet that that's kind of highly inappropriate to do. And just even email etiquette, I can remember being like kind of a big deal. There's a lot of, what I loved about that old system was that you could unsend an email. As long as someone hadn't read it,
right,
you could unsend it. And I used that function a fair amount, actually,
One of the things that becomes clear as you get experience and as you go along in this business is that many mistakes were made, for sure. But if you learn from those mistakes, they become ammo in your arsenal, right? And they make you better at what you were. It was a bit of a free-for-all at the time. We were permitted, and frankly, it's stuff that happened then would not go over very well. It was a bit of a boys' club. We were allowed to basically do and say stuff that just wouldn't have a chance now of being tolerated, I think, and at the same time, creativity, I believe, does need a little bit of freedom. You have to have an environment where it's okay to fail in certain respects. Now, that should obviously never, go into a space where people are, not feeling good about themselves. But there is something liberating about being in an environment and a culture where you don't have to worry too much about the etiquette piece and more about just the quality of ideas and having fun, because that's often where creativity does originate.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who is now a point in my career where, most of the people in the room that I'm talking to at times can be upwards of 20 years younger than I am.
Yeah.
And going through that era of like a very un-PC, old school, oftentimes, offensive and hurtful. And now I'm sure you must experience with working with young people, especially students, that they're brought up into, again, where etiquette rules have changed completely. Sure. And there's a bunch of stuff that's not okay, and you don't want to swing back into the old guy version of yourself because it was just so raw.
No, absolutely. And at the same time, I feel like the classroom experiences that I have that students enjoy most are the ones where I bring a little bit of humor into things, or it's a little bit more casual, or it's a little bit more unstructured, or again, where people feel like they have the freedom not to be judged and to say stuff and to disagree occasionally with each other, but knowing that, we can park that once we leave the doors. I think that's really important too. And being a teacher is not unlike being a creative director, in that you have to create the conditions for growth and good work. Yeah. That's really it. And a lot of that involves letting people be who they are. Because if they aren't able to cultivate their own voice in a way that's authentic to themselves, then that's going to limit them creatively. And, writing and ideas is all about expression, and that kind of expression becomes, I think, best when it's genuine.
Yeah, it's funny, I felt like in my career, being a writer that can adopt certain styles, for right or wrong, you're going to encounter any number of creative directors, and you're going to learn pretty quick what they like and what they don't like.
For sure.
And if you're adept and you can, for some people who find it very difficult, it's kind of a pain point. But for other writers, I think when you know what your boss kind of wants, you know where not to go.
Yeah.
Now, whether or not that serves the creative as best, but I know that going through all my career with different creative directors, you do learn pretty quick what the zone is.
Absolutely. And to your point, I think it's not always that you want to pander to your boss, but we were talking about this earlier, which is that we're in a business of ideas, but more accurately, I think we're in the business of selling ideas. And that selling process is constant in what we do, in that you have to sell it to your partner. If you have a creative partner, you're selling ideas to them, and then associate creative director, and then eventually the creative director, and then the account group, and then the strategists. And the idea hasn't even left the building at that point. And then there's, on the client side, there's the junior brand manager, and then there's, goes all the way up, the VP, then the CEO or CMO, then the CEO, and then every other single stakeholders. It's a constant process of selling and of influencing and of persuading. So, it's not an easy thing to do, but it's one of the, on the topic of voice, I think the best writers do know how to write with different voices. They still stay true to their own, But it's obviously going to be a very different thing talking to a 15-year-old high schooler than it is somebody who's post-retirement.
Right.
And good creative people, I think, know how to make that switch with ease. They can be agile. They can adopt their thinking. And of course, that goes for our bosses too. And we've all had good bosses. We've all had bad bosses. And sometimes you were able to sneak stuff through based on knowing how to sell to them well.
Yeah. I think, to dovetail into portfolio talk a little bit, I think, one of the key pieces of information that someone shared with me, which really made me understand it better, was this difference between high and low involvement categories. Sometimes in a portfolio assessment, you don't get that. And yes, you could write a lot of copy and a long copy piece of communication for a low involvement category, but it tends to lack a bit of substance. So when you understand that, selling life insurance and a thumbtack are kind of two different things, and that one probably requires a deeper amount of sell than the other, it makes some of your choices when it comes to your portfolio a lot easier.
For sure. And I had some great advice when I was shopping my portfolio around initially. I got to speak to some terrific people. Some stood out more than others. One of the people that I remember the conversation with very well, his name was James Lee, and he was at Roche McCauley at the time. And sadly, he passed away quite young, because I suspect he would have been one of the superstars in the business. But he paid a lot of attention. It mattered to him. You could tell when he was looking at the portfolio, which, as you were pointing out, was paper-based at the time. It was like the big leather case where you printed out your ads. But he had some amazing advice, which always stuck with me, and which I kind of pass along as well, which is he had a number of things to say, but one of the things that stood out most is that when you have a book, whether it's online or paper-based, you have to start strong, you have to anchor strong, and you have to not let the ads in the middle sag too much. You should try to aim for, obviously, as high a level of quality as possible, but the first ads matter the most, because it's the initial and first impression that the people sitting down across the table from you are going to have. The end, obviously, just like when we meet people in real life, it's the thing that you're left with, right? It's your takeaway. It's your last impression. And the responsibility of all the ads in the middle of your book, whether they're online or not, is to not disappoint, right? Is to carry people along with you. And that always stuck with me, because there is an order, I think, that needs to be established when you do share work with people. And that's why it's also a good idea. One of the other things that pieces of advice that I got many times was, it's a good idea to have many different categories, business categories in your book too, so that it's not all pieces of sports related, or it's not all fashion related, that you can show that you can think and put yourself in the shoes with empathy of people who are parents, of young people who are pursuing some kind of passion like skateboarding or whatever it happens to be, to, as we were talking about earlier, retirees who are concerned about how their life is going to go for the last 20 years. And I think it is all about that. It is about understanding people. And that's why I think it's great that you actually asked the question right off the top, is what was your background? Because our backgrounds matter. The jobs that you did when you were a kid matter, because they all factor into your experience as a person and the creativity that you bring to the table. I had lots of crazy part-time jobs growing up, and good experiences and bad experiences, but the bad ones help you learn about what you don't want to do as much as the good ones. And I had some Joe jobs, no pun intended, that were convinced me that I probably want to do something like be in an advertising agency environment, which seemed pretty cool at the time. And on that, I'm sorry, I'm going on a little bit of a rant here, but when it comes to what motivated me initially to want to get into the business, mine was actually really simple, and it was kind of corny as well, which is that it was, who's the boss? It was watching network TV as a kid, and there was this television show with Tony Danza.
Right, and she was an ad exec.
Absolutely,
right?
Angela Bauer. And it was fascinating to me because, she lived this really interesting life. I mean, she lived in Connecticut. She took the train into New York all the time. And a lot of the storylines revolved around what she did at the office, which was, storyboard, showing clients stuff and going out on fancy dinners and traveling. But there was also the creative piece to it as well. And that was actually, I think, the first time, and it was when I was quite young, when I thought, well, this could be interesting. I have no idea what that is, but that looks pretty cool. And that's kind of where it started. And the other thing that I think didn't come for a number of years, but I was at university and I was prepping for a politics paper that I was having to write, and I was procrastinating a little bit, and I was going through the stacks because we had stacks of books back then in libraries instead of going online. But I just came across this book by a critic from, I think it was the New Yorker at the time. Her name was Leslie Savon, and she wrote this book called The Sponsored Life. And it was a book that basically just dissected ads and talked about their cultural relevance. And I thought, man, this is amazing. Wow. This is the kind of thing that I would like to do. While I'm busy writing papers on, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, there are people out there in the world, who are taking popular culture seriously. And so that was kind of the second moment. If this is called the moment that changed everything, I think there were two moments that kind of convinced me that this could be an amazing career thing to do. And I was really happy that I did ultimately.
You bring up television and how it depicts things. It's kind of funny how no one can really do it that accurately. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's because, reality is, it's not as exciting as dramatizing something. But, I have to think, there's that show which really didn't get too much into her job.
No.
I think on Melrose Place, Billy was
right.
a copywriter or something like this. And at that point, having a career in it, you'd watch it. I'm sure it's the same as like the Miami Vice guys who watch Miami Vice and says, I've never worn mesh shoes in my life.
There you go.
My car doesn't quite look like that.
That's hilarious, for sure.
But it's funny how TV never quite depicts jobs as they are in reality.
Although I think it's gotten a lot better, and that, gee, are we ever meandering? That's okay. This, at the end of the day, this is a business of ideas. But television, I think, has gotten a lot better at depicting things in an authentic way, things that resonate well and actually feel true. And that, I think, is in part because they're not interrupted. Most shows, anyway, a lot of the good shows, whether it's on Netflix or HBO or what have you. They're not interrupted by commercial messages, so you're allowed to, without restrictions, tell a story in a way that feels good. And some people do it better than others.
Yeah.
We've all worked with people who were better at doing dialogue, if it came to writing a radio spot or a TV spot, than others, and that's an acquired skill as well.
Yeah, I know. There's a lot of people who there's two approaches. There's some that say if you have you have a strength in something, that you should exploit that to the max, and then other people is like, focus on your weak points, because that's the only way to raise the whole, your whole skill set up. I'm not sure where I'm at on that advice. I think what we end up doing, I think most writers do that, is they end up falling back on what they're really strong at.
That's a good point.
And sometimes that is about finding your voice, right?
Yeah, I think I've had to do both out of necessity. I came out of my university experience where the job that we had to do was take a single idea or a single topic and write 5,000 words on it. So we were, the job in essay writing and that kind of creative writing is to expand on an idea as much as possible and flesh it out as much as possible. Whereas, again, we were talking about this earlier, but advertising is very much about the distillation of ideas. It's about taking that core thought or insight and making it as brutally simple as possible. So I love crafting. And, I remember some of the mentors that I had. One of them includes Tom Gowdy, who actually seemed to genuinely enjoy the reading of the words. So that was great. But over time, I think I became more of a visual copywriter and embraced visual storytelling more, where it was about using imagery as opposed to a lot of words to get an idea across. And I feel like I became, pretty good at that. I almost forgot how to write because, as we all know, for better or for worse, most people are consuming content where words don't factor in as much as they used to.
It's true.
And it doesn't mean that a well-written long copy ad can't be compelling or can't pull you in. It absolutely can. It's just I think there's fewer opportunities for it. But I still love words, and as you were saying, that's exactly why one of the things that I do for my own creative outlet is to write articles occasionally. Take an idea and just go off on it for whatever it is, a few pages.
It's definitely a skill set and a muscle that needs to be exercised fairly frequently if you're going to do it with any. I think maybe that's it could be the easy way out when people say, well, people don't read anymore, right? And so it's abandoned, and then atrophy sets in. But it's not really true, because we consume a lot of long format things, and they keep us engaged, they keep us entertained, and I think any young writer anyway should really be open to not just telling a story in a very quick kind of way. Like, if there is a depth of sale that's required, that you got to go into those places. They're kind of scary, but you got to go there.
No question about it. I think and one of the jobs that I had as a creative director on the client side when I went tech startup was at Kobo, and Kobo's mission was to bring digital reading especially, to people all around the world. And you're right, it's not true that people aren't reading. People love reading still. Books still exist, and people still adore them. It's just that they have, our experience has become a lot more fragmented and a lot more directed to the digital space. But people, at the end of the day, still love words. And it's not just writing an ad where communication and writing matters. It's learning how to think. It's learning how to be persuasive. It's learning how to talk to another human being. And that's where the skill set, I think, really resides. It's quality of thinking and ability to communicate. And everybody needs that. Art directors need that. It doesn't matter. That's everywhere. It's like creativity. It should permeate everything. If you don't know how to write and think, you probably don't know how to communicate as well as you could, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, I spoke to someone recently about this. The word copywriter isn't an accurate one, no. And it's such a misnomer. And we haven't really been able to redefine what it is. It's hard to encapsulate in one word what a copywriter does. For because sure. I remember the indignity of it all, just showing up to a shoot that was mainly visually based. It was still an idea that I'd created, but then having someone go, you're the copywriter, what are you doing here? And it's like, what the hell? I mean, I came up with this idea, and yes, it was very few words, if any, but it's not a job where you're relegated to just writing the words. Yeah. It is so much more than that, and anyone entering the business should understand that. And that's why I was going to ask you this too, because, and I'm sure you must get this. You have I'm going to say maybe it comes from parents, where it's like, are you sure you're getting into an industry that's not dying? And to your point, ideas don't die, no. And communicating things will never go away.
And creativity, same thing.
And your value is your ability to conceptualize, probably more than the craft of writing, because the craft of writing can be an exercise that you slowly get better at, and you're a student of. But conceptualizing is where you're really going to get paid, right?
100%. And it's pretty common knowledge, I think, now, which has been great to see. But the platforms change, the storytelling mechanisms change, but at the end of the day, we still are, as human beings, it's always hardwired into us. We're going to want to always embrace stories. And if that story happens to be a 6-second video on Instagram, well, it's still a story. It still takes you on a journey. It still says something. It still communicates a message. It's the people that I think are good at and want to tell stories who ultimately are going to succeed.
Yeah. It's, I'd like to ask guests, what the work that's out there now that they like, or if there's a scourge in the industry that really gets under their skin. I think I can remember vividly, actually, my father, who was a sheet metal worker, would be sitting there on the sofa watching TV, and a really shit ad would come up, and he'd look at it and he'd criticize it, right? Like he'd point at it and go, "What the hell was, what is this?" And then he would turn to me and go, "Sorry." And he'd apologize, and I said, "Dad, it's not like I see a bent up piece of sheet metal and I go, 'Nice job, Pete.'"
That's right.
Right? But in his mind, it was like, I don't want to disparage your industry, but our industry is like, I think especially young creatives too. It's like you are putting yourself out there. Like if you have a thin skin, you're not going to really survive because everybody's looking to take you out.
Yeah, no question about it. And we say it all the time, is that's exactly, I think, the joy and the challenge of this business is the fact that I don't even know how to quantify it, but 95% of the crap out there is just that. It's crap. The job and the challenge is to make it interesting so that your dad sitting on his couch having his beer after a hard day of work actually laughs or likes the ad or thinks about it as opposed to tears it apart, because that's what we all do. We're about a month off coming off the Raptors run in the NBA, and you'd be sitting there with my kids or watching the broadcast with other people, and a lot of the ads are terrible, and they repeat them. I don't know who's doing the media buy, but they repeat them like 6 times, and by that time you hate the brand more than you like it. And that's the first thing I say to my students at the beginning of the year. And I said, people aren't necessarily interested. They don't read ads. They read things that interest them. And sometimes those things are ads. Right. So that's the challenge. How can you be interesting? Everything else is just noise. Can I interest someone, and can I get their attention, and can I keep their attention? That's basically our job. It's kind of what we do at its core.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the reasons why, I always had a love of radio, and then having the opportunity to work in it for 13 years, the commercial side I'm talking about. And a lot of writers are really kind of afraid of radio too, because there's really nowhere to hide. You've got your words on the page, and you got to create something out of it. And I don't know. I mean, I guess now with the way media is, there's probably other environments that are equally as cluttered, that are equally as noisy and hard to get noticed. But I know back then, radio was definitely one that was like, had a fair amount of dog shit in it, mm-hmm. and B, was really noisy. And let's face it, if you're there to listen to music, what happens when the ad comes on. And even the paradigm now, and as it relates to media, you have stop sets that are like 8 minutes long. And it's incredible to me that, they sell media to someone who's trying to sell something, and they relegate them to this stop set where every listener knows that it's time to change the channel and go somewhere else, and then come back when the music's playing.
Right, which is the last thing you want to do.
Yeah.
You want to give them reasons to stay with you, not reasons to leave you.
Exactly.
You want them to, swipe right on your ad instead of reject it. I think it's true what you are saying, though, especially in terms of the overcoming. It's almost a small miracle when a good ad squeaks its way through, because so many obstacles are thrown up in front of you. There's the financial obstacles. It's like, budgetary. It's everybody has a different agenda. It's people feel enormous pressure from their bosses to be as hard sell as possible instead of, resonate with them or communicate with someone emotionally. And then, you've got all your bosses and coworkers who each have their own agendas and tastes. It is actually a bit of a minor miracle when something really outstanding does make its way out there into the world and people really embrace it, because, as any of us who have been in the business know, it's difficult. It is like pushing a boulder up, and it's going to fall down to the bottom more times than it's going to stay.
I think tenacity is something that's probably not brought up enough as it relates to how to be successful in this business. You have to, and I'm not even very good at it. Like I know people, especially people like maybe like you, that love the craft part, having the tenacity to go through the waves and waves of criticism, the waves and waves of approvals to finally get in front of a client. And then really that is probably one of the most difficult part is at that point when you have someone who's paying for it, who feels that they have the authority to kind of say, yeah, it's close, but we're going to add these two things. And that's usually that moment of truth where those additions can mean the difference between something that is excellent and something that is just, yeah, better than most.
For sure.
You know, tenacity is such a huge thing.
There's no question, you know, it's often said, you said it yourself, that people need a thick skin in the business. But I think even beyond that, you need to be able to, every time you get knocked down, you know, stand up again, dust yourself off, and look at it as an opportunity, even a challenge to do better than you did the first time around. And the analogy I use sometimes when I talk to my students is that the reason why it's so tough, I think, and so emotional to lose an idea or have a good idea go down is because it's deeply personal, right? It's yours. I call it the idea baby. Every time we put an idea out there into the world, it's like delivering a baby. It's yours. It's got part of your DNA in it, and you've struggled and labored to put it out there in the world, and finally it comes out. And you know, you're the parent of that baby, and you love that baby more than anything. And then someone else sees it. Oh, that baby's actually not that cute.
That's right. It starts there.
Yeah, it's got a bit of a weird face.
Yeah.
You know, that feels like a personal affront, but you know, you're capable of having many. That's the wonderful thing about this business is you're capable of having many, many babies. And so you will lose one occasionally, but you keep on. That's, you know, it's the very nature of the word conceive. When you conceive something,
right.
You know, when the nature of this business is conceptual. So when you conceive something, you're basically, you know, giving birth to it. And you know, I love that about it. And you know, looking back on my career, there were some deeply upsetting times where I wasn't able to sell the idea that I wanted to, and if I had been able to, it would have been really great. But that's, you know, the resilience piece and the grit piece, and unquestionably is one of the skill sets that you need most.
It's funny. I mean, you continue along the baby analogy.
Please.
And everything. And maybe the one thing about, you know, there's the protecting of the baby.
Right.
You know, there's no one messing with the baby.
For sure.
But that what you see out in the, you know, what you see that ends up seeing the light of day, it's sometimes what's happened to the baby. Yeah. You know, it's like, you know, well, look what they've done to this baby. You know, there's an arm coming out of its forehead, and there's like missing a leg, and you know, its eye is missing. And it's like a lot of advertise. I knew when I worked on the production side, the first thing that I would look at when the script came in, you know, we're going to talk about how we're going to bring this thing to life, and the first thing I would look at is the rev number. You know, the rev number would tell you how many revisions this thing went through. And if it was more than, you know, if it said 14, you're in for a long day, right?
It's probably a bit of a Frankenstein.
Oh my gosh. I mean, you know, and you know, on the production side, one of the things that I try to tell the voice actors that come in, because, you know, when they come in at the end of a process, it's important that they understand that there has indeed been one. So, you know, I would be in sessions and I would see, you know, you know, the look on a face when an actor would read this, and then they'll look up and kind of go, how in the hell is that? Right. How did this happen? Right? Or
which is legitimate, by the way, because sometimes it is a bit of a turd on the page.
It doesn't make, someone has tried to survive, right? And they would look at me and, you know, or worse, they would have criticism of the work. And I would kind of go, look, you know, look at the rev number. Yeah. This is a document that's telling you that it's been through the mill. You know, it's like, you know, sometimes the baby should have been drowned.
Perhaps.
You know, we got to start with a new baby.
You have to remind, the talent. You see the person on the other side of that glass who has no color in their cheeks, looks depressed, like they haven't, you know, haven't had anything good to eat in about 3 weeks. You know, that person has PTSD. And just to get to the point where there are actual words on that piece of paper that got okayed for today. Yeah. So just deal with them gently.
Yeah, it's so true. There is those, you know, you bring up a good point. It's a deeply personal thing. And then once you have, you know, you've been run through the mill, you can really tell that it's like, it takes a while for you to get past that. I think actually with a lot of senior people, it's that ability to detach a little bit, to really rack focus a little bit, look at it from 30,000 feet, and then really kind of say, well, what, if this isn't working, maybe it's not the best solution.
Right.
Don't be married to it. Don't be so upset,
I think the most successful creative people, certainly that I've witnessed, are the ones who actually took things like focus groups as a learning opportunity. I sat in my chair where I rolled my eyes and made fun of the people on the other side with their inane comments. But it was because it was a personal thing. But as with maturity, you begin to recognize, well, you know what? People actually have valid perspectives on these things, and if you listen carefully, sometimes there are many ways to improve the thing that you've created, as opposed to it be a perfect little creature that needs no improvement or can't benefit in any way from adjustment. We almost always can, and that's why we like to work with smart people and go to production houses where people can add that kind of value, look at something and reflect on it in a way that you hadn't considered, make a really quick word change that just elevates that script, or make a little tweak to a design which just makes it even more beautiful. That's the most successful creative people, I think, are the ones who actually embrace that peer review process, who actually didn't take it personally and listened for those opportunities to get feedback. And we get feedback constantly now online. If an ad is good, it's going to get liked like crazy, or it's going to get shared like crazy, or retweeted. That's the ultimate kind of peer review. Mm-hmm. So if you don't have the ability to work with that a little bit, and sometimes, frankly, it is unfair. Sometimes a really great idea, for reasons which nobody seems to understand, doesn't take off. And then 2 months later, someone else will do something similar, which was inferior, and it'll do great.
Right. Timing
is excruciating because it's an important part of it, and you need a little bit of luck in this business too.
Yeah.
So that comes a little bit with time, but I genuinely do believe that, and it comes from that empathy. If you can actually put yourself in the shoes of somebody else and say, yeah, I can actually see where they're coming from. Yeah. If you can detach and be a little bit objective about this, and usually that comes with a few nights sleep or having something in your stomach where you're not as hyper defensive about it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad you brought up research. I think we would probably do a whole hour on research, right? Because that's a whole different animal, being strategic about how you're going to survive. Unfortunately, I mean, and I looked at research like you. I like to hear what people said, but my big criticism of research was the interpretation of what they said.
Sure.
Because they often will do verbatims, and verbatims aren't really helpful. You need to get beyond that mm-hmm. to get to what they really meant when they said it. And it's not about changing the towel in the spot from red to blue. It's resisting the urge to take that feedback literally, instead of looking at it as an overall piece of communication and kind of go, well, why are they saying that? Maybe there's something that we can change. Doesn't mean it has to be the death of something. It's the interpretation that I think should be really, you got to really look close at how they're doing it.
It's a common refrain among creative people that, research can be enormously frustrating, and not because it doesn't have any value, but because it's questionable sometimes why people use it in the first place. So for me, the objection that I have to research often is, if there's not a really good reason to do it, is it to learn, which I think is a legitimate thing, or is it more to provide yourself with air cover and cover your ass a little bit, mm-hmm. provide some kind of pseudo quantifiable support and rationalization for something which doesn't necessarily provide that kind of, ultimately it's about insights. Sometimes just hearing something. Good creative people will listen and research for a little nugget of information, or an insight into how a real person uses something in real life, and convert that into a creative idea. Because insights, the longer that I've been in this business, and the more that I teach it as well, is that I'm a fundamental believer that every great ad has a useful core insight that resonates with people. And if it can benefit your life, or if you can relate to how it fits in your life, then all the better.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think the one thing I was going to bring up too is I always found that working on big pieces of business, sometimes serve to get you further and further away from its purpose.
No question.
Working with entrepreneurs, talking to somebody, that when people have a criticism of advertising being such a scourge on humanity, I still look back at these entrepreneurs who have started something for a reason, and the closer you get to the reasons why they created it and what they saw in it, the closer you get to understanding it in a way that you can amplify that out there. Big pieces of business, sometimes you get caught in this whirlpool of agendas, and all of a sudden, you find yourself in research, and you're almost strictly there to avoid someone disliking it rather than someone actually saying, no, that resonates with me in a room.
Yeah, and and that's always the trickiest part about it. It's interesting. I feel like there are so many opportunities for agencies and clients to do things. I'm optimistic about the business in general. I don't really feel, and it's part of my belief system, I actually don't feel like we are a stain on humanity, that we are actually useful. And it's because, and some people do this better than others, but it's because at the end of the day, we solve problems. And you can always tell those pieces of communication, those ads which were tried, which had the objective or tried to solve a problem, because they do add something. They either add conversation, useful conversation to the world, or a useful solution to a problem that we had as human beings. Or maybe just it could be as mundane as just make your commute in the morning a little bit easier. Mm-hmm. I think, and there's more recognition now than there was perhaps when we started, because at that time maybe it was more about just doing something interesting, putting a kind of fun little piece of creative communication out. Now people, I think, recognize that there is built into the design of an ad the purpose of solving a problem. Mm-hmm. So that's what excites me still about this business, is that people, I don't necessarily think it's people regard the advertising and marketing business with as much disdain as maybe that they used to. We probably rank somewhere above lawyers, maybe, or other types of unsavory professions.
I'm probably getting this wrong, but you remember there was this fantastic print ad from The Economist where it had it kind of had this continuum on it, and on one end was talk show host.
Right.
And I think the end was I don't know, ad guy or something. And then just above talk show host was plankton.
Right. I remember that one.
And try to get away from that idea that, we're so inundated by communication. We're so inundated by sort of half thought through and half baked kind of communication that you can tend to, demonize the whole thing when there's usually a host of people that really. That was one of my big things with clients was, sometimes it would be, the relationship would be quite tense, and in the end, I felt like, I always wanted to put up my hand and said, we're really here to help you.
Yeah.
I'm almost kind of hurt that you think that we're trying to derail you in some way. We're just trying to find a way for you to get out there and actually say what you want to say.
Yeah. And some of my best experiences in the business have been with clients with whom you've developed that kind of trust. Because at the end of the day, they have to answer to their bosses, and they have their spreadsheets that they have to show to the CFO and justify why they spent this amount of money on this line item. So what seems to us on the other side of the table as, well, just common sense, they have to support and rationalize and stand behind it, because at the end of the day, they're at good roll if they're making decisions that are money based. That so that's why people, I think, sometimes regard creative people with suspicion, because they don't necessarily think that they have an adequate understanding of the enormous pressures that they're under and the goals that they need to meet. And again, I'll fall back on this idea that some of the best creative people are also some of the most business-minded ones, because they can empathize with their client on the other side and say, well, maybe they're a little bit, maybe they're behaving the way that they are because they're worried about something.
Right.
And then if you can reassure them that, you have their business interests at heart, or you're trying to solve a business problem for them, then that's what I think often gains trust and makes you more valuable, and a good partner.
Yeah. I mean, to, segue into, what advice would you give someone who is just getting into the business? I'm sure you must get that a lot from your students when they come to a time where they're going to go out and start shopping the book around, and they really want, have designs on becoming a writer or a designer, art director. What do you think what's your key advice for them?
So, can I share a few?
Sure.
Okay. So the first one is, and I see it all the time because students are incredibly overwhelmed when they're finishing up school. They're trying to find a job. They're trying to assert themselves economically, maybe not live in their parents' basement anymore. The hardest job to get into advertising is the first one, like without question. When I came to see you many, many years ago, shopping my book around, I think it was, I saw 6 or 7 different places that I went to, and that was just for an internship. That was for an unpaid opportunity. And you had to go under somebody's critical lens. And at the end of the day, you're just like, just give me a chance. Mm-hmm. Once you're in though, that's when you can prove your value to your employer and make yourself indispensable, because once it's hard to get in, but once you're in, if you take that opportunity seriously, I'm not going to say much that's different than what a lot of people would say, which is I think you work hard, you be diligent, you look at everything as an opportunity, because that's where some of the senior people who couldn't be bothered with this kind of brief or this kind of ad, that's where you take it and you do something amazing with it, and then you get noticed. And when you get noticed, that's what, then people want to have you around. So, my first piece of advice, and perhaps the most important piece of advice, is try not to get discouraged, because it can be completely demoralizing trying to get that first job. It's incredibly competitive. Lots of people want to be in this business. Lots of people coming out of schools. There's more and more schools all the time which serve a similar function, which is to put people in these kinds of positions. And it's tough. Breaking in is really tough. So don't get demoralized. But then part B of that is, once you're in, look at that as the opportunity that it clearly is, and work really, really hard, because hard work is never going to go away in your career. In fact, you're just going to get piled on with more stuff like kids mm-hmm. and mortgages and all of that stuff. So when you are young and you have the opportunity, make sure that you do sweat it out. And because it's not a lengthy business as well. It's a little bit like sports too. You have a limited opportunity and a limited window, sort of a limited shelf life, where you're going to be genuinely competitive. And so you have to make the most of it. And that includes working hard right from the get-go, I think.
Yeah, it reminds me of, that Einstein quote about, trying to be a person of value mm-hmm. first. When I look back at my career, the one thing that I wish I could go back and do was to knock on my creative director's door and say, what are your problems? Yeah. How can I help you?
Exactly.
Right? And I think being, call it being conscientious, and I don't even know, sometimes if you're young and you're just trying to survive and you're trying to figure out this whole thing, you might not have that maturity, but just being engaged enough to understand that, yeah, on the page, when you're doing a piece of communication, you are solving a problem.
Yeah.
There's also the problems that exist with the people that you work with. Try to not be so combative with account people. They're
sure.
not out to get you.
Totally.
Make friends with them. Try to make their life easier, and you'd be surprised at how much easier your job will go.
Absolutely. And the flip side of exactly what you're saying, and I absolutely agree with you, is don't make people's lives harder. Right. It's the single piece of advice that I send people out with. One of your biggest jobs is to not make other people's lives harder, because that's going to be that's the CLM, that's the career limiting move. You want to provide as much value as you can to those people, and that's helping them out when they're in a crunch, or looking at their work and suggesting ways that it can be potentially bettered. If you're the type of person who comes in late, that makes somebody else's job harder, right? If you're constantly combative and it's always a stressful interaction with one of your colleagues, you're making their life harder. That's one of the ironies, I think, sometimes that advertising people don't understand that about their personal brands, right? We're in the business of building brands, but some people don't understand that being a jerk isn't actually going to serve your brand. Yeah. And it's why the places that I worked at that I always liked most and often returned to, even for a second or third time, are the people where there were few to no assholes. Right? It's that classic no asshole rule. I think that might have come out of Deutsch, but it might have used to have been that people, the prima donnas, the really talented people could afford to be jerks. I don't necessarily see that as being the case anymore. People have limited tolerance of that nowadays. And maybe that's wishful thinking on my part, but I do see that. I think you have to be decent to other people too, and you have to get along with other people. Because maybe you could go at it on your own and burn bridges and go scorched earth on every job that you did, but it doesn't need to be that difficult. If people like you and they see that you do good work, that's gonna be what elevates you most. If you're missing one of those two pieces, it's gonna make your life a lot harder.
Yeah, I think when you hear somebody, maybe the generation before us, there are some pretty wild stories about how they did business. Right. You're always going to get those personalities that were tremendously caustic, maybe tremendously talented too. Mm-hmm. But yeah, those kind of, I think that's a kind of a not a common thing so much anymore.
I don't have many regrets in terms of how I approach things. I would have likely approached certain situations with a little bit more humility, like intellectual humility. One of the amazing things about advertising is that you are actually given a lot of responsibility very early. You could be in charge of this job that's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars and that people are relying on you for, and you get to go make this thing that's going out there in the world, and that's going to be on billboards all over the place. And sometimes that can result in you being a little bit cocky. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing wrong with sometimes being okay with. There's a difference between being combative and being open to criticism and being able to defend your position with respect, I think. Mm-hmm. And again, it's just see it time and time again. I've seen people's careers take a nosedive because they weren't able to get along with people, and some people learn that lesson and some people don't.
Yeah, I think knowing that there's a lot of people, different personalities out there, you're going to have to contend with within your job. But I like to ask guests this question too. I asked tell me a crazy client story, because for instance, I knew a commercial director, Ron Baxter Smith, who said he worked on a Pepto-Bismol spot, and he couldn't get away from the fact that the client would show up in the same pink jumpsuit, a pink pen, all the same color of that product, and he said it was kind of crazy. So do you have any stories you want to share?
Yeah, some of the best ones have kind of taken on kind of iconic status where you hear them passed around. So I won't share any of those. I'll share one that wasn't super crazy, but which resonates with me and perhaps will benefit some of the listeners, which is it was an automotive client, and it was a retail radio spot, and I was really struggling to do something interesting and fun and unique with it. I was getting so much pushback on putting in all the big sell words and just going really hot with talent, Sunday, that kind of thing. And so I decided to take on a strategy. He was basically like, I want to see this kind of script. So I went away and I came back and I had a folded up piece of paper that I put in a Tupperware container, and I put it on the table, and I had a bunch of other scripts. And I basically said, listen, I've got a few different scripts to share with you today. And, but I also have one over here, which I don't want to share with you, in the Tupperware container. And he said, well, why? He's like, because it stinks. I don't want to share this with you because I really, honestly, truly believe I went away and I did it, but I don't think it's good. And it actually ended up helping me sell some of the stuff that I'd written on the other scripts. And it was a bit of a cheeseball move. It kind of was corny. But again, it's just that empathy piece. If you listen, if you say, look, I did this work, but I really believe that there are better, more interesting ways to go about doing this, then that could be good. And luckily it worked out in my favor. He didn't choose the stinky one in the Tupperware container. One of the other bits of, there's millions and millions of these stories, but one of the other constant battles that I think you're fighting is to try to make your piece of creative feel as authentic as possible. So I remember it was a Japanese electronics client, and it was a TV spot, and we were fighting a big battle on should we have people who we were portraying as Japanese speak Japanese because it's this particular piece of creative happened in Japan, or should they speak English? And I was going to bat really, really hard for them to actually have subtitles in it. And it's a battle that I lost. And I remember being kind of angry and disappointed that I wasn't able to do it. You have to remember that you're not going to win every single battle with a client, that they have different agendas, that they have different fears. And often their concerns are fear-based. They're scared of losing market share, or they're scared of not getting their bonus that year, or they're scared of pissing off their boss. If you can understand that a little bit better, I think it gives you a leg up on other people.
Great. As we wrap up here, what are you doing now? Are you excited? What are you excited about? Do you have stuff on the horizon you want to talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my situation might be a little bit different than some of the other guests that you have in that I'm not full-time in the industry anymore. I teach full-time. I teach the industry full-time. So my next challenge, which is a personal challenge, is that I'm actually pursuing my doctorate, believe it or not.
Wow.
And part of the rationale for why I've decided to do that is, and this is also based on my experience in the business, is that I've always appreciated the thinking side of the business. And I feel like advertising still, regrettably, doesn't value education enough. I think there are so many ways which advertising could benefit from a constant process of continued lifelong learning for the people that are in it. And the reason that doesn't happen a lot of the time is because agencies don't want to pay money to go give someone training and then they're going to take off or whatever. And it's a problem. There's a lot of turnaround in our agency, in the agency world. But I actually come from the perspective, I think that everybody should be forced to teach, not forced literally, but should at some point or another take an opportunity to teach somebody else. Because we all had great mentors, and those mentors, even if they weren't literal teachers, were teachers as well. We learned stuff from them. Those people took time out of their day to help handhold you a little bit, or to move you along to make you better. I truly believe that there should be more of that, and that's kind of why after my career, and I still am very much immersed in the industry. You have to be in order to teach it, and that includes occasionally going out and doing work for people. But my next challenge is a personal one for me as well, in that I'm going to go do my doctorate, because I think that advertising could also benefit from people who think about the industry itself and the problems that it's intended on solving.
Well, I can't think of a better note to kind of wrap this podcast up with. A plea for more thinking, more education, in a category that sometimes overlooks it. So I want to thank you so much for being on the show. It's been a blast. I think we're going to have to have you back on just to talk about research. I think
honestly, I could go off on pretty much any topic, but it's a pleasure being here too. I think what you're doing is fantastic as well, because it's, speaking of providing value, it's going to be I hope and imagine invaluable for young people who are setting foot into a constantly changing environment where they need help and they need insights. And this is one of those ways, so congratulations to you for doing that.
Oh, thanks a lot. Thanks, Jeff.
Super fun being here. Thank you.
This episode has been brought to you by the National Advertising Challenge, North America's only brief-based challenge that sends winners to Cannes, France.